Hey everybody, it's Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. Thanks for being with us for today's webinar, Don't Get Played, How Communicators Can Defend Against Media Manipulation. We're going to be joined, and I think you might be able to see her, but if not, you will in just a quick second, by Danah Boyd. She's a superstar who's been at the forefront of data and technology. She's the founder and president of an organization that I admire a whole hell of a lot called Data and Society Research Institute. She's one of the principal researchers she is the principal researcher at Microsoft Research, if I can spit this stuff out. Sorry guys, it's still early for us. And she is one of Forbes' top 50 women in tech. And frankly, let's just say she's one of the top people in tech. Forget about gender. So I saw Danah a couple of months ago down in Miami, and she gave a talk that scared the shit out of me. And I went promptly afterwards and ran down the hall, chased after her because I had a ton of questions. And it occurred to me, if I have a bunch of questions, chances are you do too, which is why Danah has been kind enough to give us some of her time today. And for the next hour, we're going to hear a little bit about you'll hear what scared the shit out of me, and she's got some really good ideas of things we should all be doing or thinking about over the next couple of months. We're going to be talking specifically about media manipulation. This is something we've probably all been hearing about, but maybe having a chance to sort of think about in a really clear, cogent way, and that's where Danah comes in. It's a really big deal for those of us working in the social sector and the foundation and nonprofit space. We need to understand how bad actors are thinking about things like metadata, which is probably not something you rolled out of bed this morning. Or maybe today you did, but most days maybe you don't roll out of bed thinking about metadata, and how to understand how you can defend against it and protect your organization's reputation and the messages you're trying to put out into the world. All right, a couple quick logistical items before we get underway. First, if you're new to this webinar platform, we're on this new thing with Zoom, and there's a chat box where everybody, if you would, take a moment quickly right now, find that chat box down in your lower right-hand corner. Just type in their name, where you're from. We can chat there throughout the course of the hour. There's also a separate, I think it's marked Q&A box. That's where we're going to go looking for questions. We'll have 3 spots along the way to get to questions. So, and there's a bunch of really interesting stuff in this presentation, so please try to hold your fire towards the end because we want to make sure that Danah has enough time to move through the 3 sections she's going to present to us. But in that Q&A box, you can write a question and then you can vote for others. So take a look in there, see if there's a question that matches what you had on your mind. And we will, of course, as we always do, be following this on Twitter. So if you want to open another browser or another tab, we're on Twitter. The hashtag we're going to be using to organize ourselves is ComNetLive. That's COMNETLIVE. And as we always do, someone always asks, so let me get this out of the way. Yes, this is being recorded. We'll put this up on YouTube with really good metadata in the next couple of days. So keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, thanks for joining us. Let me hand it off to Danah. Want to take it away? And thank you, I should probably say, thank you very much for being with us. This is going to be an awesome experience. Y'all are in for a treat.
No, thank you guys so much for having me, and I'm completely delighted and honored to be here. I'm also excited because all of you are living in the world of trying to think through how to be smart and strategic in terms of getting out messages, and messages that are really thinking about a social good. So my goal today is to give you a framework for thinking, but also a set of practical tactics that you can take. And with that in mind, I actually made a goal slide. I was encouraged to make a goal slide. So this talk ends up having 3 sections to it. First, I'm going to give you sort of the higher order bits of what people are doing in different kinds of structural manipulation and sort of how you can think about what they're doing. Then we'll dive deep into a very specific set of manipulations, exploitation that we talk about as data voids. And finally, we're going to go through a bunch of like very practical things that you and your communities can do to make certain that your messages are heard in spite of all of the media manipulation, or perhaps because of it, in a way that we can make certain that voices like yours are actually heard. All right, so let's dive in. So you're probably well aware of the different facets of media manipulation. And the reality is that media manipulation actually goes way back. Even when we're talking about, sort of a more traditional idea of media manipulation, politicians and companies have been trying to manipulate reporters long before the internet. And what media manipulators are after in this is really about amplification. They want their messages to be heard broadly. And frankly, so do we. So some people might manipulate for economic interests. Some are politically, ideologically, or in our case, socially driven. And we can talk about what is good manipulation and bad manipulation, but the stark reality is it all becomes a pretty fuzzy line somewhere down the line. And also we get into this strange dynamic. Let's keep in mind that the major metrics in the ad business is conversion, right? And of course that has a religious signal to it and has all of these other sort of layered issues. Now, technology changed the game of amplification. It changed how marketing, PR, and advertising work. And as to be expected, it's meant that new types of media manipulation have emerged. And many of those exploit socio-technical vulnerabilities. In other words, that's really about the attack between the technical system and the social. And we're really going to dive into some of what that looks like. So let's talk about probably the most common practice that folks are familiar with, and that's search engine optimization. I'm going to assume many of you at least have the baseline understanding, but those who are not familiar with SEO, think back to when Google first launched, and its founders naively believed that they could crawl the internet and track what all the link structure was and then just present it back. And that would be a neutral portrayal of all of the information on the internet. And it was really simple, right? They would just reflect it back and there'd be no problem. They would have the perfect solution that they didn't have to think about editorial control. Of course, it took about 5 seconds for people to realize that they wanted their content at the top of that. And so they started messing with the ways in which they could try to reverse engineer what Google was doing so that they could optimize their material to end up at the top of search queries that they felt were related to them. Right? And we saw businesses pop up around this, right? Search engine optimization, SEO optimization shops that you could pay to help build link structures. And it ranged, right? Some of those were quasi-legitimate, right? In fact, pretty legitimate. They would help you figure out how to put metadata. They would help you figure out how to be smart about what you were tagging, etc. But of course, there were also far more sketchy environments, right? Link farms that started really blurring the boundaries, folks who were trying to outdo everything that Google was doing. Now, while SEO primarily existed in the world of money, activists quickly figured out how to make statements with this. It became a game. And perhaps my favorite, being a Pennsylvania native, is what happens in 2003, which is the sitting Pennsylvania senator at the time, Rick Santorum, publicly compared homosexuality to bestiality and pedophilia. And the LGBT community was not pleased with this. So journalist Dan Savage, many of you might know, he called on his readers to find a way to memorialize the scandal. And one of his fans in this process created a website to associate Santorum's name with anal sex. And to the senator's horror, countless numbers of people jumped in and built links to that website really fast, all natural links. And what happened is basically they SEO'd his name to the point where he's still struggling to have anything other than this particular reference be associated with his name when you search for it. Now, this is referred to as a Google bomb. And what makes it interesting is that it was all legitimate crowdsourced traffic and links that were built based on people with a really concerted interest, but they were truly individuals. These were not purchased linked farms, but it still served a form of SEO, one that was considered to be much more acceptable because it was vested interests of real people. And that's also where you get to these interesting dicey moments of like, what constitutes real? When is something a political act? How do we treat political speech in the US? All of this gets contested over and over again. Now, while Google has come a long way in responding to SEO tactics, its sibling company, YouTube, is kind of a disaster. And there are actually multiple reasons for this. Some are institutional and organizational, and we're not going to dive into what's going on inside the shop. But others have to do with the structure of what YouTube is. So YouTube is really strange in the information ecosystem because it is simultaneously a search engine, a recommendation engine, and a social media platform. Now think about that. You're used to thinking about search engines separately, whether we're talking about Google or Bing. You're used to recommendation engines, things that are like Spotify or Pandora, or even perhaps things related to Amazon. But you're also then thinking about social media where you're like Twitter and Facebook. This brings all three together, and actually the entryways of why people engage with YouTube actually fit in all three of these. And because YouTube does not crawl the universe of videos that are produced like Google does, they're dealing with a much more narrow set of possible topics. And that's really important because it means that they don't see even a fraction of the content that's created. And I always think about it as like they're dealing with a level of content that is kind of circa 2001 Google with far more users than we saw back then. So they haven't really developed and matured in that way. So, we'll talk more about sort of how some of those exploits happen in gory detail in the next section. But I want to talk about first how successful YouTube media manipulation campaigns work. And I'm going to start with, one that is sort of interesting to be presenting to you today because, I built this deck a week ago. And for over a year before that, if you would search for social justice or intersectionality, you would get the same results that I'm presenting you today. Which is the presence of Prager University. What's interesting is that something has changed as of Monday that no longer makes this the top, although the top is also quite conflicted in what actually emerges. But I want to talk to you about PragerU for a moment because they are an organization that is exceptionally good at search engine optimization. Now, if you're not familiar with PragerU, they see their goal as undoing the so-called leftist agenda of the university. In other words, they think that the university systems in the United States are designed to propagate propaganda to young people, and they want to counter that. And so they've been producing videos roughly once a week that are really designed to get people's attention. Now, there's a few things that are really notable about what they do. First, as you see in these search queries, they appear high in search queries. And the reason why they do is that they actually design their headlines to be relevant to the search query. So what are people looking for? So rather than seeing a headline as the thing that describes the video, they see their headline as the thing that will attract people who are doing search. And that's extremely important to them. They also are really thoughtful in the kinds of metadata that they put in there. They don't put in metadata that's aligned with the people like them. They put in metadata that's actually meant to target the people who might disagree in order to try to encourage them to see it differently. But it's also in order to encourage the recommendation components of this. Meanwhile, almost all of their comments are in their social media components of all are within network. And so that's a sort of interesting component of this kind of work. Because conservative groups are very good at understanding how language should reach different people where they're at, not where they already should be. Right? And there's a big difference there. So they start with what are people imagining? How would they be engaging with it rather than saying, this is we're speaking to inside our community. And that means that they use a lot of language that many people would find deeply problematic. Or they use language in order to undo it and to really negate it. In fact, if you watch the What is Social Justice or What is Intersectionality videos, you will hear them talk in detail about how these videos or how these terms are actually completely meaningless. And they tear them apart and they use different conflicting information in order to undo it, in order to dismantle knowledge. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. And the other thing that's important to keep in mind, which we'll get into more with data voids, is that terms like social justice are no longer used by progressive groups, right? They now talk about racial justice. They now talk about other more specific ideas of justice. And as a result, we don't see progressive groups making videos related to social justice. And that gives them an opening for search engine optimization. So again, we'll come back to that in the data void section. Now, it's important to recognize how language works when we're dealing with different kinds of communities. So, again, as I mentioned, many progressive groups focus on sort of pushing the boundaries of language of where you want people to go and trying to make certain that the language is as precise as possible. In fact, precision is important amongst scholars, amongst researchers, but it's also important amongst a lot of activist communities. But that actually means that there's a lot harder of a conversation of reading things historically. Because a lot of the outdated terms are no longer seen as socially acceptable either by scholars or by activists. And that kind of linguistic challenge creates a mess when we're dealing with comms and search. So, a colleague of mine, Francesca Tripodi, became really interested in trying to understand how people got access to information in different kinds of communities. And in this report, she spent most of her time with Southern Christian evangelicals, trying to understand how they got information access. And what was notable as she was sitting in different kinds of Bible studies is she realized that the same kinds of processes that these Christian communities were using when they were doing Bible study, the interpretation of biblical texts, right? Static texts that do not evolve. The way in which they'll do scriptural inference, they were then applying to their searches on Google. And what she talked about in this process of scriptural inference is the ways in which it was trying to make sense, not of the precision of the words, but all of the layers of intentionality around how it was produced, under what terms, etc. And that kind of scriptural inference is really important because you see this actually all across YouTube. You will see people in videos on YouTube take passages from political texts, from legislation, etc., and use the same tactics of biblical interpretation of scriptural inference onto that. But it also makes it really tricky because you're dealing with an entirely different linguistic history than Google was ever designed to manage. In fact, Google completely misses this kind of approach to language because it's not in their view. And so she then went on to talk about how search engines sort of grapple with this. And what she found was that you end up with entirely spliced search worlds. So this means that depending on your own set of values and cultural commitments, the way that you search, the language that you use in search, gets you to an entirely different set of texts than if you have a different vantage point. And so this is where you get to this huge challenge of like what information you're getting has a lot to do with what questions you're asking and a lot to do with how the language of the content that you're trying to reach might be written. And media manipulators really exploit this, right? And they exploit it in different ways. One is by trying to make certain that the language being used in the content reaches the audience they're trying to get with an understanding of what people might search for. But the other thing is actually actively trying to shape the search queries themselves. So if you spend time listening to conspiracy theory content, for example, the language that they use is all designed to enable you to search in particular ways. In fact, they will tell you explicitly what to search for. But that practice has actually seeped its way through many conservative groups as well. So if you listen to talk radio, they will say, hey, you don't believe me, you don't believe what I'm saying, search this. And indeed, if you search for that particular query in that particular string, you will get the results that they expected you to do. And this is this kind of epistemological fragmentation that we're sort of seeing because it ends up being totally different worlds, fragmented in different ways. So let's talk about what that means in practice, just so you have your head around it. When you were hearing all of the conversations about the Vatican sexual abuse scandal, most of the news media was talking about it as Vatican sexual abuse. But in different kinds of talk radio, it was all discussed around Vatican pedophiles. And again, if you would search these two things on YouTube, you would get fundamentally different kinds of content, right? Absolutely different. And this was a struggle for the search engine companies. So they, in order to deal with these things, they've often tried to align things. So for example, on the back end, they have forced the system to understand that gay and homosexuality are usually related to the same thing, right? But they're not going to collapse sexual abuse and pedophiles, right? Because that is not a collapse that they want on a back end. Those are not synonyms. And so the result is that they end up in a totally forked universes. And that means that once people start clicking on one of these things, they're also going to get recommendations for the next view, not based on trying to find ways to also hear, for example, if you're in Vatican pedophiles, the Vatican sexual abuse, because they're not linked on the back end. It's just going to be whatever people watch that particular video, what they tended to watch next, and a whole set of paths that way. So it ends up going to more and more extreme content as opposed to things that would actually do the bridging. Now, optimization on YouTube goes far beyond metadata and labeling and the search queries that go on. And I think it's really important to understand when people start really manipulating the kinds of signal that YouTube reads in order to do recommendations, not just search. So topical similarity is one thing, people who actually consumed it is another. And this is where, because YouTube, like many other systems, checks to see what people have liked, what people have commented on, what people have linked to, what people have watched simultaneously. They use all of that to try to build models of if you like X, you will like Y. The difficulty is that from a YouTube place or any places doing these kinds of recommendations, they don't actually know anything about the content itself. All they know is that if you liked video with ID number, then you will also like a video with ID number, yada, yada. And that's dynamic makes it really tricky to understand where this goes terribly awry. So let's talk about what happened around anti-vaxxing in YouTube. So you may be familiar with the fact that YouTube is now trying to take down anti-vaxxing content. And part of the difficulty is that it actually was a big problem for them, not because there wasn't good content. In fact, the CDC has a very fantastic, detailed nuance, perhaps not the most interesting, but still very good content up there. But what was happening is those who were committed to trying to radicalize people towards an anti-vaxxing ideology would spend time basically trying to thread the connections. So if you search for anything vaccination related, you most inevitably got scientific knowledge in your first thing. But, and that's because of the weighting structure for how they use search. But the next video in autoplay was almost inevitably an anti-vaxxing video. And the reason is that anti-vaxxing groups basically would make new videos, and then they would have, in a distributed way, have people watch the CDC video and the anti-vaxxing video, like both of them, comment on both of them, really try to connect them on the back end for all of the signals that YouTube were receiving. And that made it really difficult for them to deal with this because they couldn't see the content. They have no way of actually seeing content at scale. They just see the structures. So as they were trying to uprank, they basically decided that this is a kind of material that they're not going to continue to support because much of it is conspiratorial, much of it is completely fabricated in how it's produced. Now, that doesn't mean that they have removed all of it. And one of the things that they tend to have up there are doubting videos, right? Things that are just meant to be like, is there a correlation? So rather than explicitly stating inaccurate information, asking questions. And the asking questions videos are the hardest for everybody to deal with. It's also true for text in Facebook and Twitter, which is that rather than actually explicitly saying perhaps a white supremacist statement, just asking something. Right, and let's also acknowledge that CNN did put a chyron up that says, are Jews people? Right, when they were interviewing a far-right actor. So this is the kind of thing that ends up happening, which it's just a question. So another way that actors sort of can play and manipulate these systems it was sort of brought to my attention through my colleague Becca Lewis, and she was really interested in why a set of political videos kept recommending each other, and what was all the link structure that was encouraging all of this, what was giving them that level of attention. And she recognized that when people co-appeared on a video, usually in the form of a debate, that made a linking structure between their channels, right? Not only because their audiences are connected, not only because it was topical similarity and they connect to each other, sometimes there's co-appearances, but also because of a whole variety of ripple effects that happen around those videos and the ways in which they get tagged by fans. And this meant that the very practice of inviting somebody to debate was a way of connecting things that were from sort of mainstream, socially acceptable views to various degrees of extremism. And she talked a lot about how this process of somebody who was a relatively mainstream actor inviting somebody with a more extreme vantage point onto debate meant that the viewers of that debate were encouraged to then consume even more extreme videos, and it would continue down that path. Now, the other thing that happens in a lot of these political videos is the ability to chop them up. And so by making all of these, and reposting clips, by making all of these small videos, you will end up seeing, thousands of videos that are subsections of an original video. Perhaps the best way to understand this is to see the effect of the Joe Rogan show. So Joe Rogan relatively recently invited Jack Dorsey and with him Vijay Agadi from Twitter and also Tim Pool in order to have a debate. And Tim Pool is pretty antagonistic towards Twitter. And so they're having a conversation, and it's a 3.5-hour video, but part of it is that a whole group of people then chopped up that video into 1-minute segments all over the place. And there were thousands and thousands of these 1-minute videos, all linking back to the original video. So really amplifying his SEO, but also being able to re-narrate, re-script that, and for a range of different ideologies, right? So the different kinds of responses about how to position it, but it all created a massive amplification, which guarantees that Joe Rogan content really gets to the top, not just because of his subscribers, for which he's got many, but because of the strategic SEO around this. Now, tech companies keep grappling with different aspects of this, and they keep running into all of these problems where they're often seen as being, conservative, where they're having a problem here, and this is like this anti-conservative bias conversation that's happening in Congress, because they're accused of censorship, and it's particularly accused of censoring conservative practices. And I think that's really important because, as I mentioned, Francesca's work actually shows how these things are completely segmented into entirely different worlds. The work that's been done trying to analyze PragerU shows that they are one of the most sophisticated of SEO actors. Folks like Joe Rogan, who do not sit in a clean political spectrum, invites people who actually have a variety of views on there, but often the recommendation structures actually encourage people towards conservatives. So where is it that this, sort of anti-conservative bias is coming from? Now, part of it is that extreme actors have done a very good job of positioning their own content as being conservative. And that's where things start to get really dicey. So you have this at a conspiratorial level. In fact, PragerU has been forced to bring down some videos on YouTube for being conspiratorial. But you also have this from folks who may identify with far-right communities, may identify with white nationalist movements, but also a variety of people who propel values like this often through questioning as opposed to explicit material. And so as these companies are trying to grapple with the different kinds of hate speech in the terms of service violations, what they end up dealing with is a lot of content that is very slippery, very ironic, where it's very difficult to tell whether or not you're trying to make a extremist point of view or if you're just joking. And this continues to be a huge challenge for them. And as this content is removed, you have conservative actors screaming that conservative content has been removed. So an example from this week is that a teenage girl's video was removed under hate concerns because the video advocated, and a lot of her own content advocated for killing Muslims. And then a whole group of conservatives stood up against the censorship of this girl, saying she was just kidding. And that's the kind of situation that you're seeing in this slippery space right now. Now, the other challenge is that the tech companies are facing a lot of new challenges that they never knew how to deal with. So let's talk about Christchurch. And there's really three components to Christchurch, but I'm going to focus on one. First, we need to acknowledge it was a horrific, violent attack by a terrorist with white nationalist perspectives in Christchurch, New Zealand, right? And 50 people died as a result of this. So I want to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge that the terrorists very much set it up to be within a certain kind of tech culture and a certain kind of subculture in these environments in order to propel a variety of white nationalist ideals. So that's also important. We can dive into that in the questions if you want. But the third thing is actually really important, which is that after the violent terrorist attack, after the terrorist himself was arrested, millions and millions of videos were uploaded to Facebook, to YouTube, to Twitter. And it became this huge challenge. It was a flood of content for these companies. And they were completely overwhelmed by it, because part of what was happening is that they weren't just seeing copies of the video. They were seeing constant modifications of the video. And they were not able to easily detect all of the modifications. And these are the kinds of things we're also seeing from people with much more extreme views, is they're working hard to try to get past any of the restrictions. They're working hard, not just in terms of language, but also in terms of trying to figure out where the systems might block things. All right. But there's also sort of other more mundane aspects of where tech company interventions can actually go terribly awry. So many of you may have heard that YouTube decided to fix its sort of quote-unquote fake news problem by creating links to Wikipedia for anything that might have been problematic. Well, that's a little tricky, because what happened is that, for example, I'm going to use this PragerU video, which is what they haven't told you about climate change, right? Which is really set up to enable a climate change denial perspective. And they've set this up in a way that has, creates all these sort of problematic signals. Now, what's fascinating is that they recognize that climate denial is a problem, and while they don't remove that content, they do make links to the Wikipedia because it's in that sort of zone. But for whatever reason, the links in here go to global warming, not climate change. And indeed, if you search global warming on YouTube, what you get is hoax content. And this is a really interesting thing because it's not clear to me. I suspect it's because of the metadata that is used on YouTube by PragerU. But this dynamic is a way of actually sort of using Wikipedia as a tool to keep undermining these practices. So I'm going to go to questions in a second, but sort of in conclusion on this section, much of the contemporary media manipulation is about actively targeting not just the content, but also the structure of these technical systems. And by really messing with the structure of it, they can amplify different kinds of content, ranging from stuff that's just about economic interests, and we didn't talk about all of the ways in which like Coca-Cola does this, because they do, all of the way through different kinds of political and ideological ideas. But the reality is that some people are far better at doing this, and most of those people who are really good at gaming these systems are either heavily financially funded, like some of the marketing groups, or ideologically conservative. There's very little that is actually optimized in these environments that is ideologically progressive. All right, so I'm going to pause for a second. Are there questions that folks want to dive into? Oops, Sean, I can't actually hear you because you're muted.
There we go. All right, guys. So this hopefully gave you a little flavor of how Dana scared the shit out of me. This is at least to me, it was a big revelation. I guess most of the questions we have right now, Dana, and so maybe we can jump forward, are sort of tactical. I know we're going to get to them a little bit later. So if we can agree, maybe just wait for a few questions. I think the one that I would ask is, it sounds like, as you were just closing there are two principal actors who are working to manipulate right now. One is sort of the for-profit, there's an economic motive, and the other is folks within the conservative movement, or maybe even some of the extreme far right, or I don't even know how you want to categorize them. We used to just call them cuckoos, extremist views. Why is that? I think there was a conceit, I certainly had this, that progressives had dominated the social space, that the Barack Obama election in 2008 was the first social election, and that people with a more left point of view, a more progressive point of view, were really good at this. And now seems like that's no longer true. That really kind of counters my understanding how things work.
Right. So, I mean, part of it is to recognize all of the different ways in which people learn, and these things constantly evolve. I think you're right. For a long time, it was, Move On, for example, was very good at working within these systems. And let's be honest, like BuzzFeed is pretty darn good at it. And they're one of the more sort of left-leaning news organizations. Legacy news organizations have actually been dreadful at SEO. So they didn't really build out their own set of skills in that space, which is why we've seen some popping up of, your Voxes and your Mikes and all of these other sort of groups who are much more sophisticated. The other group of people who, and marketers, right? Like, if you actually really want to understand the history of who's good at SEO, look to big oil and look to big tobacco. They go way back in a whole variety of these things, and they also helped propel a variety of conspiratorial thinking. So, for example, big tobacco spent a lot of time paying influencers to pretend to be regular people smoking on videos. They paid for a lot of scientific knowledge to doubt the correlation between cancer and smoking. And that work, once they paid for it, they propagate it through digital means. So they had built a set of marketing that actually helped propel a lot of conspiratorial and fake science long before we're in the contemporary moment that became political. Meanwhile, a group of teenagers started hacking into the attention economy circa 2004, 2005, right? These are really the origins of what we now know as 4chan, or what was then known as 4chan too, but most people didn't know about it. And it was really sort of joking around, and by and large, it was youthful, bending towards progressive movements. You had Occupy that was in there. So you had a variety of things in that period. But things turned circa 2014, and it wasn't just that they turned politically. That group didn't actually change. Many of that group was not that politically motivated. If they were motivated at anything, it was like against the state, and they didn't like the state, but it was not actually fitting within our nice progressive conservative boundaries. But circa 2014, what we saw was a convergence of people who were far more extremist, including a bunch of white nationalist groups, converge in on these spaces and learn the tactics. In fact, a lot of them taught each other tactics. So you had a whole group of extremists and conspiracy theory folks who were really learning these tactics. And what has been less clear to me is how those tactics, which matured and developed within conspiratorial and extremist groups, did work their way through a bunch of different kinds of conservative actors. Not all conservative actors, but it did work its way through some conservative actors, really 2015, 2016. And that's sort of seeing those tactics both affect, the conservative movements towards the election in 2016, but also a way of thinking about this content and about sort of fighting back against what they believed to be liberal tech companies. And so that's where a lot of the motivation is also that they believe in these groups that they are being screwed by tech companies and that they need to fight back in these systems, and they see it in two different directions. One is fighting back from a policy place, and the second is fighting back from manipulating the systems at scale. And what's very difficult at this point is because the extremist groups are so good at hiding under the covers of mainstream conservative groups, it becomes very slippery very fast. And in fact, if you look at the network structures of it, it becomes very difficult to disentangle extremist groups from conservative groups, even if the subject matter is fundamentally different. The networks, the followers are completely entwined at this point.
Wow. So a question maybe we can get to before we jump forward. Someone asked if you could just explain again what PragerU is. I think for a lot of folks, this is the first time maybe they're hearing about this, this organization.
So PragerU is best known for making videos. They are very highly financed, usually about $30,000 a pop videos. They usually involve bringing on some expert to talk about an issue in a title like what is social justice, and to really drive into this. And the idea that they imagine is that their goal is to undo the so-called leftist agenda of the university. So it's a very anti-contemporary science, contemporary ways of knowledge production, and trying to undo that. It is backed primarily, it's created by Dennis Prager. It's backed by different conservative groups. It tends not to focus on big P political topics. It's much more about redoing ideas of like Thanksgiving, where it's like, basically no natives were hurt during Thanksgiving kinds of things, and other sort of hot button social topics. The thing to know in terms of its impact is that they self-report that 1/3 of all Facebook users have watched a PragerU video on Facebook. Based on what I'm hearing from professors at universities, they believe it because their students are being asked about the frames that are set in motion in PragerU videos over and over again. And the students constantly come back with those terms. So they're getting it both on YouTube, where it has heavy dominance, as well as on Facebook. And if you know about it, then also on their website, where that includes the stuff that Facebook and YouTube have banned.
So another question, just a sort of a level setting question for everybody, and then we'll jump back into this. Are you at this point, given what you know, and given what you just shared, are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic?
I think that knowledge is power. So I think that the important thing is you understand how this works, and you understand that there are different agendas that, have operated for a long time. I'm of the belief that this country was built with white, supremacist logics, and we're still living with that pain and history today. I think that it's irresponsible of us to not challenge that. So I think it's about understanding how it moves. And in my head, one of the things that I think is confounding with regard to the tech companies, they don't know how to navigate the value structures that we take for granted. And so I see this sort of interesting move. So if you take Michelle Alexander's argument, or Brian Stevens' argument, that we went from the original sin of slavery through to Jim Crow, through to mass incarceration, and that as each was being dismantled, the next one is being built. I'm a big believer that we are seeing the build out of the next version of white supremacy through the kinds of control of these tech systems. And, just like we saw with mass incarceration, we didn't understand it at first. We didn't understand how, progressive groups got played in the process. And progressive groups were some of the most, actively thinking that, 3 strikes and you're out would be good for folks. They believed that, mandatory felonies, equal punishment would be good, not realizing what it would lead to. And I have a feeling that we're sort of in the same place. So if you want to call that optimistic or pessimistic, my belief is that we need to know it. It's not surprising. It's the way that history cycles, and it's our responsibility to fight it.
Gotcha. Let's move ahead if we can, just being mindful of time.
Perfect. All right, data voids. We're going to dive deep into like one specific tactic just so you can sort of see how it plays out. So data voids is a term that was originally coined by Michael Golubetsky, who works at Bing, Microsoft search engine. And he was trying to understand what happens when the search engine is unable to provide high-quality information for a query because there was no high-quality information available. And so he was trying to understand what this looks like, and so the two of us started diving in and trying to see what are the different components of this. And we really focused in on 4 types of notable search data voids. And I'm going to talk about those 4 because you can see how they affect the space really well. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is a breaking news issue. So when a news story is breaking, search engines don't have information, right? They don't have things that are crawled very easily. And so on November 5th, 2017, news outlets blasted to everybody's cell phone that there was an active shooting in Sutherland Springs, Texas. If you are like most people, you've never heard of Sutherland Springs, Texas, and you had no more information. So the natural thing to do was to go to the search engine and type in the one thing you knew, Sutherland Springs, Texas. Now the difficulty is that until that day, literally no one had searched for that town in the prior 2 years, right? And that's really notable because if you search for it, there was really nothing. It was Zillow content and census page. It was kind of the automatic production that's produced for every town in this country that has a name or zip code or anything. So they'd never seen that before. And so what were they putting out? In situations like this where there's no information, they're trying to read on other material. So they go and they look to Twitter and Reddit, and they're trying to pull in material at this point. Now this makes it a target. It means that people want to aim to manipulate that as fast as possible. They want to put up tweets to associate it. And within far-right groups, what you saw was that people wanted to associate the shooter, even before any information was known, with Antifa. And part of it is at the time there was efforts by far-right groups to create a false equivalency between what they described as the violent far left or Antifa with them who they decided was like trying to respond to the violence of Antifa and that they as far-right actors. So meanwhile, as they're producing all of this content as fast as possible, they're also aiming for journalists because they know that once the news starts pouring in, news will take over the front of Google. And so they were doing this pretty actively. And this journalist, Michael Hayden, understood what they were doing. So he went really fast to an article where he articulated that this was all a manipulation game. The difficulty is that his editor titled the piece, which is actually a pretty sophisticated piece, they titled it, Antifa Responsible for Sutherland Springs Murders According to Far-Right Media. Now, if you know anything about how Google displays material, you know that they cut it off after a certain number of characters. So what that means is that for the first 24 hours, the top search or top material you would get would be this Newsweek article that just said Antifa Responsible for Sutherland Springs Murders. Right? That was the top search. And that was a huge win within these far-right groups. Because let's be honest, when people search, they usually don't click. They just read the headlines across the page. So that kind of headline manipulation, I don't know what Newsweek was doing or why that editor did it, but the result is it was a very effective game. So that's the kind of thing of like a breaking news situation. And this happens over and over again of trying to own the breaking news narrative. And I should note that this is a disaster on YouTube because even when people are making content and reasonable reporting, the news organizations don't put the stuff to YouTube very fast. And nobody outside of the news organizations makes videos about this unless they're trying to manipulate the space. So the second kind of data void is around strategic terms. And this actually grows out of a longer history. And I'm sort of fascinated by the work that Frank Luntz did in the 1990s. So for those of you who aren't familiar with him, he's a political operative who was sort of well known for supporting the Gingrich Congress. And he was known for creating pithy talking points through all these sort of focus groups that he'd hold. But it wasn't just the fact that he created these pithy talking points. He figured out how to get those messages out. So every week he would meet with staffers from Republican elected members, and he would, or sometimes the members, and he would say, these are the talking points for this week. And he would put these terms in motion so that the members, whenever they were talking to the press, would turn any conversation and reference one of those phrases that he had coined. And you know many of his phrases, right? Partial birth abortion, climate change, death tax. These are all his phrases. And he had many, many more. And that way of sort of targeting journalism and making journalism build a drumbeat was extraordinarily successful for conservative groups. Now, today, what we're seeing is sort of a shift in that, right? So we're seeing, instead of it happening direct to news media, we're seeing people build out an entire ecosystem of terms and make sure that there's Wikipedia entries and YouTube content and web pages and everything you could possibly imagine. Get the term ready and then push it to news media so that when the news media uses it, people come back and search it. And that kind of coordination means that they're throwing spaghetti at the wall all the time, these folks. And this is really honed in on by conspiracy theory groups. They're probably the most sophisticated about this. So let's consider the term crisis actor. It actually emerged in conspiracy theory groups after the Sandy Hook shooting. The argument was that the people who were talking in TV were not really parents of kids who were murdered, but they were crisis actors. They're paid for by the deep state in order to take away the Second Amendment, right? And that's sort of the frame that got put in motion. And after every shooting, which is sort of where I'm pointing to the interest over time, after every shooting, the people who would speak out on TV were considered crisis actors. And generally speaking, the news media did a good job of ignoring this until Parkland. So even though that conspiracy was all over the internet, they didn't say a lot of it. And then at Parkland, Anderson Cooper actually asked David Hogg if he was a crisis actor on national TV. That put the term through the roof. We saw nonstop interest in the term. We saw all sorts of people participating in it. And it was that amplification. And these are the kinds of wins that the conspiracy groups see, as well as other sort of groups who are using this tactic. So some of the other terms that you may be familiar with that use the same process are incel, globalist, deep state, white genocide, right? So you're starting to hear this more and more. And this is where journalists do the work of conspiracy theorists and far-right groups by amplifying the terms that have been purposefully staged in order to get to search, because once you get to search, you get to go down rabbit holes. And this sometimes it's actually done within digital only, which is the case of Dylan Roof, finding black on white crimes, which was a term that was designed for this particular thing. But sometimes it's done usually through the news media. The third kind of data void comes from terms that were once in common parlance, but no longer are. So this is why the link to global warming is important, right? People don't build new content on global warming, and so now that things have shifted to climate change, that becomes a huge problem. Like anything on global warming is just missing. So the fact that scientists don't use that word means that there's not a lot of content in the digital ecosystem. It's also why we see issues with social justice. But let me also sort of give you an example of sort of how this plays out just specifically within YouTube. Consider the term Negro, right? So like the N-word, context matters here. And although many Black and African American individuals use this term and feel positively to it, they don't actually produce a ton of content on the web using this term, either in a positive or a negative manner. Whereas the N-word has been reclaimed and there's a lot of positive content using the N-word, as well as obviously a lot of negative content. So with limited amounts of data, what happens is that search queries then sort of, in a place like Bing are going to tell you, this is an outdated, it has sort of complicated history, and you get to all these definitional stuff pretty fast. So you get the idea that it's a dated term, you get sort of what it references, etc. And that's sort of fine. It's like, okay, YouTube is a different matter, right? Because YouTube doesn't actually try to contextualize this stuff. It tries to find out what it can put best there. So when you search for the N-word, you get a ton of content that's actually positive with people trying to reclaim it, because there are a lot of groups producing YouTube videos trying to reclaim the N-word. But Negro is a different story. Then you get archival material, get that historical material. Civil rights groups don't make stuff with this term anymore. And so when you look at this, when the second thing is the Reagan video, and you're like, what is this? Let's dig into this. You get an uncritiqued clip of our former president making a very racist remark. You get a slew of racist comments that are actually very much, helping drag you into more conspiratorial and far-right spaces. And you get all sorts of different kind of amplification. So this means that because there's not a lot of conversation there, you get to use this to amplify in search to actually bring people into the social. And the social becomes a vector for actually pulling people into, in this case, white nationalist ideals. So the fourth kind of data void starts with a fundamentally problematic query, right? There's nothing good when you start with why or did the Holocaust happen, right? And so this is another one where we're seeing some cleanup in some spaces, but of course you see a ton of conspiratorial content on YouTube, including a lot of Holocaust denial. And what's important in this, of course, is that it's often done in sort of legitimate voices. As you see a bishop denying the Holocaust done as a CBS news report, but of course it propels this information even as it tries to undo it. And that's where you start to get this interesting moment, because it's not just this material. So you have this content, which is maybe okay, but then the comments are where you start to see the challenge. And in Holocaust denial videos, everything, you'll never find a video related to the Holocaust that doesn't point to a particular video with a controversial Adolf Hitler documentary that tries to paint him in good light and makes no reference whatsoever to Holocaust. And this is seen as sort of the real red pill in Holocaust denial communities, and it's a gateway. So basically when people watch this, it's like they'll see all these comments and all this stuff will pop up saying like, this doesn't really explain it. You really want to understand what happens here, watch this video. And that gets you to that video. So now, while it's easy to caught up about how some of this is fake and problematic, what we're seeing about this is actually a strategic production of ignorance. It's a coordinated attack of trying to undo knowledge by really playing with the information that's available. And I've been thinking a lot about this because there's a group of scholars that came together in the 1990s to talk about how ignorance was purposely being manufactured. At the time, they were mostly concerned about the production of fake science by commercial actors, and they referred to that study as agnotology. So if epistemology is how we know what we know, agnotology is how we strategically undo knowledge, how we basically enable ignorance. And so climate denial didn't come out of nowhere. It actually starts with big oil. Anti-vaccination also has this sort of really sordid history. So these efforts to do this, they get taken up by people who believe themselves to be real believers, but they're very much manufactured and then they're propagated. And that's where it's really important to realize that the lack of available meaningful information, the inability to get high quality content to fill these data voids, means that a lot of these adversarial actors are using questioning as a way to pull people into doubt, and using doubts to give them a new frame of extremism. All right, I'm going to pause because now I went and got deep. We're going to go really tactical next, but are there any other sort of high-level questions before we go into the tactical?
There's a bunch of questions here, and I think, but in the interest of time, because I want to be respectful of yours and everyone's, why don't we jump into the next section, then we'll do the Q&A at the end. One thing to note, because this surprised the hell out of me, YouTube is, I'm guessing, it was certainly true for me, I'm guessing with the folks in the audience, it's probably true for them, it's not your preferred place to go to get news and information. But
that means you're old.
That mean and that means you're old. But you shared with us down in Miami. That's simply not true. If you break it down, Gen Z, maybe you could just a quick minute on that and then jump into the
last. So YouTube is the primary search engine for under 25s. It starts by trying to figure out how to tie a tie, or how to, figure out a calculus problem for your class and your 12th grade class. And then all of a sudden you're using it for all different things. The most subscribed to actor who was referenced in Christchurch in really challenging ways, has a news channel that is has more subscribers to it than any major news outlet. And that's a real challenge because people are actually consuming this content. They're getting their cultural frames. They're getting their opinion from this. And so part of it is that they feel as though TV news is all opinion. They'd rather get opinions from people they trust. And that's often within gaming community, which is one entry point, or within, commentary, and they are really attracted to the quote unquote debates that they see as very authentic, which is why those things get staged. And these, you have a hard time when you're talking to under 25s. They're watching YouTube regularly, not just to watch video, like music videos, but everything else.
And so if you're being strategic about it and you don't have a YouTube strategy or you don't have a presence there, you are practicing, it's malpractice at this point. Is that a fair assumption?
Absolutely. So let's give some of the sort of practical pieces so we can talk a little bit more. So first things first. Basic search engine behaviors, right? So you should know, if you don't know how a search engine optimization works, get somebody to train you. It's really important to understand the basics of this. The very simplest one I'll give you is if your organization is putting a PDF on a website, that material is not getting out there. Convert your PDFs into HTML, optimize that HTML, make certain the link structures work. PDFs are great for printouts. They're not great for actually optimizing for the web. And this is a pain point. I say this as an organization that produces PDFs half the time in order to bury it, half the time to be useful, because they're pretty and they're wonderful and they're filled with all the reports that all of you have been writing and are used to handing to an expert. But if you want it to be found in search and you want to optimize it, pull it out, make images with little sound bites on it, put things up that people can spread that are not just the full, dense text. And that becomes really important as a strategy for civil society writ large. Another really important thing is video, and this is to your point. YouTube is that primary search engine for so many people. If your content is not available on YouTube, many people are not coming to it. Being able to make a quick sound clip of like what's going on, even if it's just a talking head, 30 seconds videos, figuring out ways of doing things with graphics. They don't need to be high production value. Of course, if there are funders out here who want to start doing high production value, I strongly encourage it because it's actually desperately needed. But a lot of this can be done without that high production value. And we need you to upload things everywhere, right? Because you want the content not to be a destination site, which is the bane of my feelings about news these days. So you don't want to just have to go to your site to get the information. You want your stuff to go everywhere else. So you want little mini clips of your content. You want videos of people in your community speaking on a regular basis. You want to have that drumbeat. And if you want to get sort of level up, watch the Vox, Mike, and Now This videos and think about what your explainers are. Because if you can produce Now This level explainers, that makes a huge difference because you guys are experts in these spaces. Speaking of PDFs and videos, how are you titling your content? That's something you should be asking yourself at every turn. I am an academic. We are terrible at titling things. We assume you've read the entire book, and only then might you understand the joke we were playing on the title. We're dreadful at this. I wrote a book called It's Complicated. If you can tell me what that's about, I can't tell you from that title. But if you're actually trying to think about search, you're trying to think about things that are available online, start with the titling to be exactly what people are looking for. Give them the title that is the entryway, even if it's a question, before you sort of give them what the answer is in the pithy title, right? And if you really are, feeling you need to have something, like at least go with subtitles, right? So, but give them the question first, give them something that they're entering. Realize that information access these days is about starting with search, and that's really important. For all of you who are in nonprofits, if you are not already signed up for ad grants, Google has the biggest ad grant program, but there's ad grants on Bing, there's ad grants related to YouTube. Ad grants are free advertisements for nonprofits. Now, this is a really important thing to do because it's a way of getting your information out there. Now, the question then is, how do you use it strategically? And make certain that they're not just getting to like your latest report, but that they're getting to information that you find really valuable, things that actually can help them get there. And the question there is, are you trying to reach the audience who already loves you, or are you trying to reach a new audience? And that's really how you want to start to think about building on your terms. So like a classic example is that if you're doing immigration rights work right now, you might be incentivized and think you should be, searching for, undocumented or things that are people searching for that. No. Be buying on terms like illegals. It's an offensive term, but if people are searching for that, you want to pull them into a different frame. So thinking about how you can reach the different groups where you're trying to actually shape them. And in that mind, once you get involved in this, learn how ad auctions work. One of the things that I find people do, well, first off, they bid on terms, again, with the same titling problem where they assume the audience is already on that frame rather than bidding on something else. Second, because even when you get the free ads from Google, you pay for them out of the budget that they give you, and the terms are raised based on how many people are bidding on it. So if you all decide to bid on the same thing, you will raise the rates of all of you. And this is something to explain for the funders that are on here. Think about coordinating folks to strategically buy on terms with all of their budgets from these nonprofit ad buys, because if you can coordinate this, the prices are lower and you're actually not competing with each other, because that's the worst thing you can do with limited resources. You should have a strategy about likes and comments within your community. Don't just beg for them. Talk your various members through the process of how this works and how it gets optimized on these systems, and say, can we build a strategy? What would that look like? And do it in a participatory fashion. We are within the civil society sector, so how do you actually involve people in this process? How do you inform them about how content operates in this ecosystem and involve them in the process of making certain that they're actors in your amplification? So rather than just sending it out and please like this, really educate people about what's happening here, so that they can actually be co-constructing a strategy with you. And in that same sort of mindset, thinking about how you want to think about what you give attention to. So the big thing is like when you amplify something, you want to make certain that you're amplifying content that actually makes everybody better. So don't be amplifying the content that's there to, but basically if you start with the content, it's like, I'm going to negate this, you undo it. Really amplify the good content. Another thing is really build a strategy that I think of as threat modeling. What are all of the ways in which your entire community can come undone with this? So like, what are the kinds of messages that really undermine you? And can you really think about the dangerous messages that you want to undo? And this is a really good text for looking at how, basically how news organizations should be thinking about it. Whitney Phillips, The Oxygen of Amplification. So I really encourage you to think about the threat model, about like, what are the frames? Think about all of the risks rather than just thinking about the positive. Also think about where you should be filling out data voids on topics that are relevant to you. Search for a whole variety of things in a negative way that are related to topics you care about. How can you make certain that there's evergreen content, that it's maximized? How do you create those soundbite videos, those 30-second commentaries, so you really have your content worked through? And if you really want to level up from this, the next big thing is to really think about every aspect of your network, right? Most of you think about member lists, all the people that are included, but you don't think about how they know each other. You don't think about the structure of the network. You don't think about how to connect new people strategically. If you start thinking as an organization about your entire community within networks, you can start to really think about how information is flowing or not flowing. And that makes a huge difference, because after all, everything that's happening digitally right now is happening in a networked frame. So if you can build it offline and online at the same time, everything gets stronger for civil society. All right. There are the very quick, 8 takeaways, and I realize that we've gone late, but I'm able to stick around for questions if you all are.
That is awesome. So let me get to them. And thank you for once again scaring the shit out of me. Okay, why don't we start with Peter. Is there a source you'd recommend for learning more about bad actor strategies that are intended to hitch extremist content into mainstream or legitimate content? So example, the strategy that you mentioned of watching and commenting on 2 videos that bad actors want to suggest to connect. Want the suggestion algorithm to connect, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is that there's a lot of us researchers who are working in the space. The thing to realize is that, I think of this as a security issue. So it's not that there's a tactic that is stabilized and will be used forever forth. In fact, it's a constantly evolving process. And part of what we're all trying to figure out how to do is connect the researchers, the tech industry, different kinds of civil society groups, so that we can all be watching these things collectively. Now, that said, when you start to think about things as a security issue, the question is, what kind of information do you make visible to everybody else, and who do you share with? And generally speaking, you don't want to publicize strategies that groups are doing, because they'll exploit them furthermore until you've built tools of resilience. So a lot of the work that us researchers do is trying to actually convey that more privately to people who can actually make a difference around this, rather than amplifying those strategies. The other thing that we try to do when we think of it as security issue is what security experts refer to as like burning a strategy. So there's moments where you want to talk about a strategy in order to burn it, in order to make it hard. So like one of the reasons that I'm talking to you about data voids is like, I actually think you can do things about it. Now, a lot of this also comes down to your own theory of change, right? And so I want to acknowledge that because, you know, I've given you a bunch of really deep tactical responses to this, and some of you might be much more interested in just blowing it all up, right? Saying, I don't want to play under these rules. These are, you know, capitalist rules. These are, you know, the rules of the state. And I respect that. And I think that that's where there's a really interesting tension, because the components I'm giving you are about like staying within those components, staying within the status quo, and that may not be good enough. But I will say that, you know, the nicest thing about civil society pressure onto the tech companies around some of these issues is that they are investing in doing more analysis of, you know, the bad actors, and they are trying to level up. But because it's a security issue, there will be new exploits, there will be new ways of getting around it, and every one of those interventions will be circumvented. And that's one of the reasons why we all have to be thinking about where this is. And the big question for all of you is this where you want to best spend your time trying to obsess over what they're doing, or are you better off figuring out tactics to amplify your own work? And a lot of it's going to depend on the goals of your organization.
Okay, question from Colby. Love to know more about how to fight back against a Google bomb.
So, you know, ironically, this is where the very simplest Brandeis story of, just providing more information actually matters. So, you know, one of the things that, you know, many of your organizations may be facing is that you're getting different kinds of Google bombs that is trying to, you know, negatively portray your organization. You'll get different kinds of things that try to shape, you know, the reviews of your organization, like all of these different places where it comes. And to the best that you can, getting other people to legitimately add content makes a huge difference, right, over time. It doesn't fix it fast. There are also various cleanup shops that can actually sort of see if any of the coordinated efforts are illegitimate and can be reported. When they're illegitimate and can be reported, those can be taken down. And that's particularly true if like bots were employed or other automated accounts. If the Google bomb is truly coordinated individuals, the companies won't remove it at present. Unless they can actually find out that it's false or all of these other things. But that's, you know, that's a fight, and it's just a question of that. So probably you want to hedge your bets. You want to figure out how to be reactive and, like, you know, fight, and you probably also want to start producing a ton of counter content.
Okay. Can you talk about how you know when a company decides to manually connect topics behind the scenes? So you mentioned, for example, YouTube now purposely connects the word homosexual and the word gay, but they don't necessarily always make other connections. The example you gave of the Vatican with sex abuse and pedophilia is not something that they would. How would you know that that's occurring?
You don't. And part of the challenge for the companies right now, I mean, this is the entire mess of this space. They desperately wanted to be able to do everything through algorithms. I mean, this goes back to literally, you know, Page and Brin thinking, like, if you read their paper, it's almost adorable. The grad school paper that started Google, which is just like, we won't have to deal with, you know, abuse of content anymore because we'll solve it through PageRank. And you're just like, oh, guys, like, you have no idea. So part of it is that PageRank no longer looks like it did. From the days of SEO and spam, they were constantly evolving things, and they try desperately not to do anything manual. So they try desperately to do things that are really logical. So one of the things that they have really started to do is use dictionaries for synonyms, right? That's just a clean and easy one. Dictionaries for synonyms are the ones that actually everybody feels better about, right? Here's a list of things. Where they're struggling with it are on high political topics where there's a strategic fragmentation of language, and they're trying to figure out how they navigate it. And they're basically what they're on the lookout for are things that are strategically polarized. But they're in the midst of it. They're all doing it individually. They don't know. They don't have a framework for it. And that's one of the things that I think is, you know, going to be a difficult piece going forward, because on one hand they need to actually coordinate with each other, and they won't because of collusion issues. They also need to be more transparent about it for all sorts of community reasons, but they won't because of abuse issues. So there's these interesting questions of how oversight and accountability operate in here. And I would say that my expectation over the next 5 years is the battleground of governance of these algorithmic systems is only going to get greater. And it's not clear to me that it's full public transparency as the solution. A lot of it, the things that I've been thinking about is like, what are external auditing stakeholders that we need to talk about? And how do we also think about what that means at a global scale? Because a lot of the biggest challenges of this are not happening in geolocated areas in the way that you can talk about financial auditing, which is easier to talk about in a bounded region. So I think the questioner just hit the nail on the head. It is a big old mess. It's definitely not been solved. You definitely don't know. It's definitely constantly evolving. They don't want to do anything manual. They do it in manual during crisis because they're trying to deal with whatever is going down.
Another question, another anonymous question, but does anyone on the left of the political spectrum who works in advocacy do media manipulation especially well? Is there an example to look to that you might replicate among netroots kind of groups?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why, Eli Pariser and all of his sort of strains of different organizations, they'd always been very good at following it for a long time. But they got exhausted and the funding was a pain. So even though they were really good at it, they didn't sustain it. And part of it is they didn't sustain it into this new evolution, right? Mm-hmm. So
for folks who don't know Eli, do you want to just call out a couple names to maybe help jog people's memory?
Sure. So you probably know Move On. You probably know Upworthy. These are two of his instantiations. You probably also know his book on the filter bubble. I mean, he's a very thoughtful person about how these systems sort of evolve. One of the weirder parts of the 2016 presidential campaign is that the Clinton campaign did not actually build big capacity in this area, which is what actually occurred in the 2012 and 2008. And what that means is that a lot of progressive groups typically came out of the two Obama campaigns and then worked for a variety of civil society and progressive groups. But that didn't happen after 2016, which I think is notable and concerning. So I didn't see people really leveling up in the same way. And so I think one of the open questions right now is, who are all the actors that are building capacity right now? And most likely, if they're, politically motivated, they're looking to the 2020. But given that there's, a bazillion and one Democratic candidates, who knows where they're all at this point? So I don't, it's more a matter that I see, some shops that are good at different things, but I don't see organizations that are particularly sophisticated. Oh, I should say the one organization that gets campaigning better than anybody else, which is a different way. They don't play media manipulation like this, but they get, like that last point that I made on network structure, Color of Change, it should be worshipped for their ability to be smart on network structure. They understand how to operate in networks. And while they don't do media manipulation, because they don't really operate at that level, their network strategies are, absolutely best in class. And so, if there's any organization that I trust to level up into this space, it would be Color of Change.
Alex has a question. It sounds like we shouldn't be afraid of using language that we don't like. So, for example, we should be thinking about optimizing for keywords like global warming because people search for it regardless of how we may have some professional distaste for that term. Is that accurate? And if so, how far do we go with that optimization while keeping in mind that we won't want to give undue attention to certain kinds of search terms?
So I think a lot of it is thinking about what's your strategy for moving people to where you're at already. So let's take, the climate change conversation. Like, the irony to me is that global warming was the progressive term. Frank Luntz created climate change to make it less scary, and we've all adopted it, which I find really interesting. But let's just take it, for starters, the big thing is to take a term like global warming. Don't just, SEO on it. You can SEO on it, but you can also explain why the shift happened. You can explain why these things are connected. And that's actually even more clear to me in more socially constructed issues. For example, history of race in this country. Our terms have changed in many different ways. But people who are young and they're, reading history books, they get to the old terms. So what does it mean that they're searching for that? How do you think about what they're searching for in the old terms? And then how do you move them along? So rather than sort of saying, oh my gosh, I hate you for having used this outdated term, say, look, this term, we decided to make it outdated. We decided to deprecate it because it started to signal this. And we didn't mean for it to signal this. And so it became this sort of interesting question. So then you're actually helping people get to where you're at. And I think this, by the way, is one of my deep concerns about progressive groups, is that they just expect people to be where they're at in language. And that's actually one of the things where I'm really seeing amongst youth who are not already in those networks, whose parents and their communities are not already there, are not getting held by older progressives to basically make the transition from whatever rhetorics their families have to whatever rhetorics are considered to be socially acceptable. And so this kind of holding to me is really important. So this is, another big tactic that this is less of a comms tactic, but an organizing tactic. So when I was a teenager growing up online, and I was trying to figure out my own sexuality, and I was asking all sorts of highly inappropriate questions in Usenet, because yes, I am that old. It was actually an older trans woman who walked me through all of it, who helped me understand why the words that I was using was problematic, started asking me questions that allowed me to process my own confusion, and what would sort of form a queer identity came from this woman who genuinely held me without ever knowing me. And one of the biggest challenges that I've seen in a lot of the evolutions of the internet is that in creating and manifesting either safe spaces or brave spaces, depending on where in the community you are, in that manifestations, we're not actually trying to hold people who are struggling, who are lost, who are confused. And what I am seeing is that extremist groups are holding these young people. And that's what's deeply concerning. So they're not just playing a communications games, they're holding them. They're letting them struggle and work through these issues. They're not shaming them because they don't already know. And they're giving them languages and tools that are deeply concerning. So the other thing I would say is that in addition to this comms, if you can build strategies of who can hold people, who can reach out to people, who can be commenting on things, one of the things you will often see is that the videos of young people on YouTube, they'll make videos talking about whatever issue that they don't understand. And then what will happen is that people, especially from extremist groups, will pounce on them. And they will help them say, oh, those feelings are legitimate. Here's why, leftist groups are there to mess with you. And they really try to pull them down rabbit holes. I do not see any of that occurring amongst progressive groups, not even to try to pull them to extremists, but actually to hold them through their confusion.
Talk to me a little bit about, it seems to be one of the things that you've sort of illuminated here is a workflow challenge. I was talking to my wife who works at the EPA, and after I saw your talk in Miami, and I shared with her some of the things, and she said, gosh, you have no idea. When we make a video, for instance, we then hand it off to a tech team, and they do all the metadata. Comms doesn't play any role there. My guess is that's fairly common, that comms people build stuff, and then where it's placed in infrastructure, and even in some ways how some of the information is shared out, sits in other offices. Does that sound right to you? And if so, what are some strategies coming from the tech community to sort of talking about holding people? How do we build bridges between the tech side of shops and the comms shops?
What that sounds like is it's been corporatized, right? Which is unfortunately where much of the civil society structures have been corporatized in a legacy style without any of the agile dynamics. And so the result is that what you really want is a co-creation between people with tech sophistication and SEO and people from the comms side, so that they're working together with two different knowledge sets and they move fast. If you do it where it's a handoff, you lose all the advantage of both knowledge sets. And so, yes, it requires restructuring organizations. And one of the difficulties for me about, sort of moves within civil society is that, from the late 60s through the 80s in particular, civil society went from really being, movement leader run to, in many ways, lawyer run, and that legal structures sort of dominated huge types of organizations. And that's still true for a lot of legacy groups and a lot of sort of, longer standing groups. Comms has always been secondary because the idea was that you were communicating, certainly for legacy groups, you're communicating with political stakeholders and policymakers. So those reports become really valuable. And the fact that they were put on the web was just basically for fundraising. So there's never been like a comms first approach to a lot of these groups. And that's one of the reasons, like I'll go back to, showering praise on Color of Change, because in many ways they're a comms first movement group. And so there are other comms first movement groups that are emerging. And what I would say is that, like, maybe it's a matter of empowering, for the legacy groups, maybe it's a matter of empowering a group to be a comms first group within a legacy organization. But no, the workflow that everybody operates on that's corporatized, it's not going to work. That is a PR campaign, not a part of the community and movement strategy. In order for this to work, it has to be part of movement strategy, not just, mass outreach.
Gotcha. Question from Alex, and then I have a question for you about PDFs, because I want to be mindful of your time. Alex says, and this I think speaks to the last comment you had on holding, do you have any advice on how we should be moderating comments on our content? How do we balance censorship with encouraging real dialogue? So
it all depends. First off, values first, right? Make sure you understand what your values of the organization are, and what your commitments are, right? So, I mean, again, this is that conversation that we've all been having around safe space and brave space, and what does it mean to have those hard conversations, and how do people actually get affected by those hard conversations, and how are they managed and mentored through those hard conversations? Anytime that those things happen at sort of a larger than two people, the likelihood of trolls is huge. So I think asking yourself, like, what behavior is unacceptable? And then there's a question of how do you socialize people into that behavior? And how do you socialize, and what are the kinds of saying, like, hey, I'm going to call you out. That behavior is not cool. Can we talk it through? And one of the ways you can do it, again, if you're doing it within community, is like, can we get on the phone? Because it's interesting, if you change modality, that often changes every aspect of the dynamic. And that, classic stuff that we've all learned of like, hey, what you stated made me feel this way, and then being able to articulate, I felt this, I'm not trying to accuse you of that, but I want you to understand my feelings, and depending on what dynamic you're dealing with, it's like, I didn't mean to make you feel that way. It's like, so how can we work our way through this? So this is that question of, like, again, how tight are you doing it, or how are you doing it en masse, right? It's a very different dynamic when you're talking about thousands and thousands of comments versus within a community where you're actually trying to think about, the org plus network. And so, when you're dealing with a broader component of it, you can still set community standards. You can still have moderators, right? And I think there's a lot to be said about empowering beloved members of your community to be moderators and to think about different kinds of timeouts. Even for folks there, I've been like, hey, that wasn't cool. So thinking about those kinds of moments, because it's just like shutting someone down, that doesn't help. You really want to move them with you unless they're actively being a troll. And then, like, come on, like, whatever. Like, if people are trolling you, that's a different game in all of this. And that's not about censorship. That's about, violating the norms and violating everybody's time and energy and emotional space.
And we've seen some great examples of this, and it seems that it always gets a little bit of public attention when it occurs. I'm thinking of Sarah Silverman and Patton Oswalt, who were both attacked, and their response, I think, I certainly found heartening. And for those who don't know, what they did was they actually reached in and grabbed the person, embraced them, and had a dialogue. And it turned out, built a relationship, something that started in conflict. Or at least started from trolling. So there's opportunities to learn here. Let's pivot a little bit on the PDF thing. This is a personal.
Before you do that, I want to
sure. Yeah, please.
One thing, which is that recognize that a lot of people, especially when we're dealing with civil society, they're hurting out there. They're lost. They're confused. They're looking for attention. And think back to third grade. Some people seek attention by doing negative things, and if you shut them down, you help create bullies. You help create harm. And I think as organizations, in civil society, we need to put a mandate of do no additional harm at the center of what we're doing. So that's a moment of like, are you actually helping the cause by shutting people out? Or are you, and it's always that time and energy. And that's why I'll respond to funders. Like, because we're dealing a massive security issue, supporting people through this kind of process is a really important part of this. And how can we level up all of the organizations that exist so that they can actually do this community work, which is at the center of what we're all trying to do anyhow.
Okay, again, going back to PDFs, which I think is a bit of a workflow problem, and I know you make them, we make them, but can you explain to people in technical terms what a PDF is and why it's so problematic when you're trying to share knowledge and information on the web?
Right. So PDF is a proprietary format. I mean, you all know it. You can open it in, Adobe, or you open it in Preview, because they've bought the rights to allow you to open it. But if you try to open it in your text editing thing, you can't open it. And what that means is that Google and Bing and any other search component, which crawls the internet, and it basically goes through it looks at every link, and it tries to index every website, and it gets to the bottom of the website where it encounters a file, and that file is called a robots.txt file. And that robots.txt file says, hi search engine, you may go here and you may not go here. And the search engine says, thank you, I will proceed now. And then it goes through the different parts of your website and says, are you a file I can read? And if it's a file I can read, I will bring you down, I will index you back at the search engine company. I will index you, I will look at all of the terms in the language, I will watch all of your links, I will bring this into my model, and it's great. You encounter a PDF, and it's like, I don't know how to read you. All right, so I'll take just your metadata, which is whatever happens to be the metadata of the PDF file, which is clear text in the file, and says, great, I'll take your metadata, bye. So it gets your title, basically, and anything else you might have put in the metadata, and none of your text. Now, that is great if you're going for basic obscurity. Now, it's awful if you want that material to actually be indexed and spread across the web. There's another layer to this. Many of you are probably using WordPress. You probably uploaded your PDF from WordPress, which means that you have this URL from hell, right? And it's like this awful URL with like all sorts of subfolders. Google might not have even seen it because it wasn't at a mainline URL unless there was something pointing to it from the past that it actually could see in the process, because it doesn't go through every file that's uploaded by your WordPress install. Right? And again, whoever's building out your technical work should have some sense of how this happens. The big thing is that what you want to be thinking in ideal form is you want to make that PDF. Make it, because you're going to print it out. It's going to be the pretty document that everybody wants to see. It's gorgeous. And it's going to be the thing you want to download. At the very least, the very simplified version is make a flat website, right, with a reasonable URL that at least gives like some part of your executive summary or your abstract, and then clinks the PDF. That's the simplest thing to do. Now, the smarter thing to do is to take all of the text and all of the visuals in there and make an HTML beautifully versioned one as well. Still, at the top, you can link to the PDF for people who want to print out, because no matter what, the HTML printout is not as pretty. And if you want to take it to the next level, you then go and you take one of the sound bites, right? The things that you've clipped out that you probably put in some beautiful, call out box in your PDF, and you want to take a graphic, and you want to put the call out and the graphic together, and you want to put that on different parts of your website, again with beautiful metadata, and then you want to put that call out into Twitter with your tweet about the thing, so you have the picture with a great message, and then you have the tweet with the link to the HTML file, not the PDF file, in Twitter. And then again, next level, you take all of those little sound bites and whatnot, and you start to make different versions of videos. And you could do it through different kinds of, visual commentary. Like, it doesn't even, you just, take a publicly available song, take these things as little sound bites. You can go with 1980s style graphics. Like, you don't have to, sort of level up. So you can do it with what's on your computer and make a simple thing that's sitting on YouTube, even if it's basically just image after image after image, as a way of producing a video that's available. And then, of course, you can sort of level up on video all the way.
Gotcha. The way it was explained to me is that it's possible that the things that are necessary to cure cancer, as a for instance, a piece of it sitting on page 28 of a Norwegian researcher's PDF in Oslo, And there's a person, a woman in Berkeley, who has another piece of the puzzle, who's looking for that data from the Norwegian researcher and will never find it because it's on page 28 of the PDF. And the only thing that's publicly available on the web, she does a Google search. The only thing that's publicly available is the title and maybe the abstract. And of course, the abstract doesn't have that piece of data that she's actually looking for. So she just walks right by it. She never even knows that it's there. It's the ignorance piece. PDFs perpetuate ignorance.
Well, so that is even a higher level problem. So, we're talking at civil society where you pretty much have the right to put your material up online on your webpage. But when we're talking about scholarship, they're sitting behind closed, corporatized publishing units. So, as a researcher who sits outside of the university, doesn't have the university library access, I come across all of this research that I can't get to on the web because I don't have access to the online libraries. And so either I steal it, which isn't great. I have to know what's in it before I pay for it at $15 an article. So if I know I want it, I can pay for it, but I don't even know if I want it. I have no way of doing a search across those systems to see what's there. So and then you add in it's in Norwegian or it's on page 28 as a PDF. And that's one of the problems right now with the state of science, which is that the state of science is not publicly visible. And so even as everyone's talking about, open data, open science data, I'm like, can we just start with open knowledge of all of the raw material? And I think that's what, there's been activists that have been fighting for that, and a good friend of mine died fighting for that. But I think it's a huge battle because the result is that the best knowledge that we have that's publicly available is at least coming out of civil society. And, it's one of the reasons why, I think that an activist movement amongst scholars is to do everything possible to put things out publicly. And it's why as a researcher myself, I am deeply committed to open access and publicly available material. So it's not just PDFs for me, but it's putting everything out as much as I can in HTML.
So
But it's a battleground.
Let me ask you a question. What would it look like if every foundation out there decided that as a piece of its strategy and as a piece of its funding, it required, if you produced knowledge or information using its grant dollars, you had to produce it digital first?
So the various publishers have